conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
And welcome everybody to another amazing day right here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Of course, I'm your host, Andrew Cooperrider, and on today's show, there's been a recent poll coming out in that Senate race, as well as a few other pieces of news, a pack firing up in our Senate race, the hotly contested race to replace McConnell. So we'll be digging into that information, and candidly, I'll be going through what I think their strengths and weaknesses are for the three major candidates. That is, of course, Andy Barr, Daniel Cameron, and Nate Morris. So we'll dig into that. Also, Fayette County Public School Superintendent Liggins is pulled before a legislative committee where he has to testify about some of the extreme spending that's been going on within the school district. So we'll have that. And then finally, Jefferson County Schools is also having an issue. Apparently, according to the testimony made in one board hearing, the board has been deprived of pertinent, that means the same thing. Anyways, important pieces of information that have shaped their fiscal decisions. And as a result of that, they're now facing a deficit of $188 million and will need to sell off assets in order to make sure that the school district remains solvent. On top of that, there was some suggestions made by some school board members. We'll go through how horrific they are. And, even if they had the information, they probably would have still made bad decisions. So we'll have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. First, make sure if you're listening to this in the podcast format, you're subscribed to the podcast, you've liked it, you followed it. If you're watching this on Facebook or Twitter and you want to be able to take it on the go a little bit easier, I encourage you, go to your favorite podcasting platform, just search Andrew Cooperrider, or just search even probably Cooperrider, Cooperrider. You should be able to find it. And if you're listening to this on radio or TV, thank you for joining us. If you want to check out past episodes, you can check them out there, the same place, by going to podcasting, or just head over to theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's theandrewshow.com. And if you're listening to this in podcast format, please make sure you leave me a 5-star review. Always helps out. But without further ado, let's dig down into it. So we have a new poll coming out. Now, this poll was put out by a PAC associated with the Barr campaign. So anytime you have a campaign itself putting out a poll, you have to take it with a pretty large grain of salt. What's especially sort of suspicious about this poll is they didn't release the crosstabs. So there's a lot more information they collect when they're polling people, like the districts they are in, how heavily they polled certain places. So for an example, in Andy Barr's campaign's case, they're putting this out. Obviously, if you poll the 6th district heavier than the rest of the state, and you should see about equal turnout across all congressional districts. But if you poll the 6th district a little bit heavier, you're going to get a better result for Barr than if you poll other places as equally and weight it to what you actually expect the turnout to look like in each district. If you want a real poll that tells you what's going on, that's kind of what you want to have. Also, it's not very clear whether or not this was something called a push poll. That's a poll where they're trying to get a set result, and if you give them a different answer, they'll kind of push you a little bit and see how susceptible you are. But regardless, the poll does point to something, okay? So the poll was of 600 likely GOP voters. They found 37% favor Cameron, 29% favor Barr, and 8% favor Nate Morris. Now, right there off the top, those percentages, you see that Cameron's in the lead, of course. So you say, well, why would the Barr campaign put this out? Well, a poll put out, an internal poll earlier put out by the Barr campaign had only 18%. So they've made 11-point gain. That's why they'd go ahead and put it out. But there's a problem that the Barr campaign, of course, has, and I think the Morris campaign as well has with this poll, because when you look at the percentages, you have 37% for Cameron, you have 29% for Barr, and then you also have, 8% for Nate Morris, currently favoring, and of course that changes, but that's 74%. That means you have 26% at this point undecided, and favoring doesn't mean they're going to vote for that person. It kind of indicates they didn't ask the question, if the election was held today, who would you vote for? That's an important, of course, question to ask, but 26% undecided. Now, the problem I think that has for both the Barr and Morris campaign, and this goes into strength and weaknesses, and based on what I'm seeing out there in the field, is that the default right now is Daniel Cameron. I've said this before on the show, that in most races, you might have a three-way race, and it's a toss-up. When they're undecided going into that booth, it may be kind of like, well, are they going to go Nate? Are they going to go Barr? Are they going to go Cameron? In this race, however, you can be pretty rest assured they're going to go with Daniel Cameron because he's a well-known name. People know him. They feel comfortable voting for him. Chances are they've checked his name before on a ballot box, and so that kind of old behavior takes over when you don't know what to do. You know, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And so that does point to some issues. You cannot have, if you go into Election Day and you're Barr or Morris and it's a close race between them and Cameron or et cetera, and you have, you know, a 5 or 10% undecided rate, that should spell victory for Cameron. Now, of course, the other aspect to this is the Trump endorsement, and I want to take a moment here to discuss it because in large part, the Morris campaigns and Barr campaigns have been obviously heavily targeted at trying to get that Trump endorsement. But as we all know, Trump endorses based upon how you're doing in the polls. And I've only think of a few times, perhaps Vance is an example, where I think he was fourth in Ohio, but it was still like a close race between those four before Donald Trump went in and endorsed Vance, putting him over the edge. However, if you're seeing something like being 10 points down from the leader, if Trump does endorse you, he's going to probably endorse the leader as well. And that's a point of conversation because a lot of people have said, look, you know, Barr and Morris have better relationships with the Trump White House. But on the other hand, Cameron, you know, he's gotten that endorsement from Trump before. Trump's unhappy with the fact that he lost to Bashir. However, Trump does like to win. And if somebody's massively up in the field, the chances he doesn't also throw his name behind them, I put as pretty low. So going into the poll, though, after we get through the percentages, we have favorability ratings. Now, 6 in 10 voters saw Cameron favorable, while 4 in 10 saw Barr favorable, and only 1 in 10 saw Morris favorably. That's very interesting. Now, of course, that 6 in 10, it's going to be hard to redefine Cameron. He's been through, obviously, a few elections with attack ads and people going after him. I don't see, even with a good attack ads and trying to come at Cameron, I don't see that 6 in 10 changing that much. Now, the 4 in 10 for Barr can present a little bit of an issue for him right now, especially as you have a Club for Growth attached PAC putting out some ads. Here's one the ads are putting out where they're calling him out for supporting Trump Congress people who wanted to impeach Trump. Take a listen to that.
McConnell as an intern.
My mentor, leader Mitch McConnell.
Then a never-Trump politician, funded by Mitch and Liz Cheney. And now the student has become the teacher. Barr blamed President Trump for January 6th, then bankrolled 4 rhinos who voted to impeach Trump.
Some Republicans will be voting for impeachment, and I respect that.
Groomed by Mitch, Trump hater like Mitch. That's Andy Barr. Winnipeck PAC is responsible for the content of this ad.
So there you go. That's that PAC ad. That's going to affect, of course, how this turns out. We'll be discussing a little bit more about what the Senate candidates' positives, negatives are, why I think the race is shaping up the way it is. After this short break, you're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you are back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before the break, I'd mentioned a new poll coming out in that Senate race, as well as some different dynamics shaping up in the race to replace McConnell. And I wanted to go over what we kind of can learn, not just from that poll, but just in general how it's shaping up, what I'm seeing out there in the field. So let's first start with Cameron, positives, negatives. Cameron, of course, has the massively high name ID going for him. Everybody that's going to be voting in this primary, as I said before, has most likely, like almost 100% of them, have check marked the box at some point for Cameron. And, frankly, old habits are hard to break. Also, Cameron is, in case you've never met him, an exceptionally good retail politician. And what I mean by that is that when you discuss with him, and this is important because we're going to talk about why perhaps Morris might be, if this poll is to be taken seriously, might be struggling with favorability ratings at that only 1 in 10. See, Cameron comes across, he's very genuine when he talks to you, and he remembers things. I mean, one thing I remember, this was back when I was running for state treasurer, and he was running for governor in that primary, and we would spend time together all the time at the same events. And I remember we were chit-chatting one time, and I had brought up how I was going to be cooking my Thanksgiving dinner. I was going to do a roast by burying it, not a roast, a brisket, by burying it in my backyard on some hot coals and see how it would turn out. And what's amazing and kind of shocking to me is months later, I was talking to Cameron and he brought that up. He said, how did that turn out? I was very interested to know how that went for you. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who's experienced those kinds of things with Cameron, where he's very good at remembering things about you, remembering names, of course, and then drawing upon that to create that personal relationship. That's great. But also, he doesn't suffer from something that many politicians do, where it doesn't come across as fake. It doesn't come across as if he's just kind of putting on a show. And it helps him out too as well that his wife does come with him. That shows support, of course, and his wife is very friendly, very nice, very engaged. And that kind of helps you out with winning over people as well. They feel like they're your buddy. Now, of course, the downside for Cameron is obviously that he lost in that governor's race to Beshear. And so a lot of people brought up, look, I don't think he ran a good campaign there. We're worried about losing the seat. First, I don't think you actually have to worry about that. One, I give it a 1% chance that Beshear ends up actually running for the Senate. I know a few people have kind of thrown that around. Well, what if Beshear jumps in, then Cameron's going to lose and blah, blah, blah. Beshear isn't going to. Listen to me carefully, clearly here. What Beshear is angling for is a run for president. Whether or not he wins the presidency, and he, let's call a spade a spade, most likely won't. He will have the opportunity, though, if a Democrat wins, to serve in the cabinet. So he has a wealth of opportunities available to him to go ahead and do that. He's got obviously the chance of vice president, all the cabinet positions, infrastructure, commerce secretary, all things that I'm sure he'd love to grab onto and be able to serve to continue his political career. And his edge, his whole gambit here, the reason why he says he's somebody to talk to is because he's a Democrat that won in a heavily red state. Now, of course, they're ignoring the fact that Beshear is won our governor elections or an off-year election, so it's largely a turnout game. They're ignoring who his daddy is. They're ignoring the fact, of course, he was an incumbent that got in while Kentucky was still kind of transitioning over to being a Republican state. I believe when he first won election against Bevin, Kentucky was still a majority registered Democrat state. That has since changed. But that's important to draw out, and it's important to mention because that all plays into the dynamics you don't get on a national stage. So basically, but his edge, I guess, his selling point is that, look, I can get along, I can win back the Trump vote. Now, if he runs for Senate, and just so you know the history, I don't think since the 80s a Democrat has won statewide for the Senate, which is the only statewide seats, on standard election years, every 2-year election years. Instead of an off-year election, they every 2 years election. I don't think he's ever done, a Democrat has ever won since the 80s. So it's been a good length of time. On top of that, he's not an incumbent. This is a different kind of concern. Also, Trump did win heavily when it comes to national politics, and Kentucky voters can divorce the idea of national and state politics in their minds, and that's something else Beshear must be worried about. And I think Beshear's probably pulled that race and knows he wouldn't win it, and so I think he's going to stay out of it. It's too much risk because if he loses, he has no more political future. However, you try for president, and if you lose in the primary, you have a political future. You do. As a cabinet, as vice presidential candidate, as something along those lines. That isn't something that gets shut off to him. But people are concerned about that. They don't like the race he ran. One of the complaints I've heard is they don't like that, the paying of some legal bills and those types of behaviors that went on while he was Attorney General. I must say what is kind of helping him out, though, look better as Attorney General, just frankly, is that Russell Coleman is not doing a stellar job, according to a lot of the grassroots people. He's doing some things well, don't get me wrong, but when it comes to certain fights he should be picking, he's not. He's late to the game on a lot of national fights. He's basically, his name is not in the headlines a lot as a leader when it comes to conservative thought. So what helps Cameron, again, name ID, well known. He is very personable, a good retail politician. What hurts him is obviously just that loss to Beshear, but I think a lot of people, especially Beshear, doesn't jump in after the filing deadline. That concern goes away, and you could actually see Cameron getting a bump from that. Now on to Barr, 29% favorability rating. Now the good parts for Barr is he has a lot of institutional support. The quote-unquote establishment across the board is with him. That being stated, I will say this, the grassroots across the board, regardless of where you're at in the political spectrum, seems to be supporting Cameron. So the leadership level, we're talking the state party, the leaders within the state legislature, etc., they seem to be with Barr. But then the grassroots leaders across the state, most grassroots names they seem to be supporting Cameron based upon what I'm seeing online, a lot of that. So that leads into, though, Barr does have that institutional support. Obviously, his money, he's carrying over $6 million about from his congressional account, so he actually doesn't need to raise any more and still run a competitive primary. He will continue to raise. That helps him out. He's currently voting in office, so certain groups will be giving him money just to curry his favor when it comes to votes and committee votes and things like that he will make. So that helps him out. What hurts Barr is he does have a voting record that is not in necessarily Congress with the image he's trying to curate. And I've said this from the beginning, that I almost think Barr would be better off embracing his past votes and running a lane that maybe you can grab 40% of the vote in, instead of trying to run a lane that if you're successful, you can grab, 60, 70% of the vote, but you have competition in that lane of the other two candidates, so that cuts it down. There's nobody really running this moderate whatever lane that Barr has the background for. And I think that hurts him overall. Also, of course, while he's known within his district, he's not known statewide. He hasn't been a household name when it comes to federal politicians here in Kentucky. And so he has to define himself as well. And you have that PAC, I played the ad, dumping millions. I believe they've spent about $3 million so far going after Barr, that Club for Growth associated PAC. That is, oddly enough, helping Nate and Cameron a lot. One of the concerns about Cameron is, he doesn't have the money to run the race. Well, if Cameron doesn't have to actually attack Barr, then and this PAC's going to do it for him, then that actually gives Cameron the ability to win this race with maybe only raising something like $1 million, $2 million, instead of needing to raise $3 or $4 million that you would need to put out and attack ads and to attack somebody else like Barr. Somebody's doing that for him. They're not even supporting a particular candidate. They just really don't like Barr. I think that hurts them. Then when you come to Nate Morris, Nate Morris's positives is, unlike Cameron and Barr, he doesn't really have a political history, and he can use that to craft an image of himself. Obviously, the other campaigns are trying to go ahead and paint him as well, but Morris will try to craft this image. Now, the problem with what I think some of what Morris is doing right now that may lead to this lack of favorability rating, and I see two things. First is he's running a campaign that seems very targeted at pleasing Trump, not making a case as much to the voters themselves. The biggest case he's made is that he's not a Mitch McConnell guy. I think that is a pretty good line. We can tell this because the other attacks that are coming out against Barr are pointing out his ties to McConnell. They wouldn't spend millions on that without knowing there's some there. Also, nobody's trying to claim that they're going to be Mitch McConnell's replacement and vying for Mitch McConnell's endorsement. So clearly, Mitch McConnell and being associated with that is not a positive, and painting yourself as not him is great. But you would like to see more policy coming out that he's shaping what kind of person he's going to be on the policy front. However, right now, most of his policy statements have been widely at, it seems like, pleasing the Trump side of things, not as much at gaining voters. And I think you've got to be targeting voters, not just signaling the way Trump would want. And I'll give you an example is his ads on tariffs. There's no Kentucky voters out there that really, really like the tariffs, just frankly. They may be okay with it. There's some that may like it as a percentage, but it's not like nobody's asking, like when I talk to people and I'm like, what are you looking for in your Senate candidate? Nobody's like, well, do they support the tariffs? They will say, do they support Trump? And that could be what he's signaling, right? But I think you could bundle that in with some other things and not just kind of ad only about supporting tariffs. But that ad was clearly cut in hopes that the Trump White House sees it, and Trump sees that, and he can get that endorsement. The other issue I think Morris suffers from a little bit, and I mentioned this early on, I've met other politicians that run into this, is a little bit of the, I don't want to call it personability, because Nate Morris, I've talked to him quite a bit. He's very personable. But are you getting a curated version of Nate, or are you getting the real version of Nate? Now, it doesn't mean he's necessarily fake. I'm going to clarify what I mean by that here. I'm coming up on a break, though. So we'll be back in a few short minutes. We'll finish out looking at this race here and then dig into the school things when we come back. And you are back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before the break, I'd mentioned that I wanted to just finish up my analysis real quick of where the Senate race is sitting at, then dig into the schools. And I'd ended the last segment by saying that Morris, on his likability and favorability ratings, if this poll put out by the Barr campaign is to be believed, why he might be struggling. One, he's undefined. It doesn't say they view him necessarily unfavorable. It's just, do they view him favorably? And some people can say, look, I don't know a lot about the guy. Now, when it comes to personal interactions with individuals, and I've talked to a lot of people that have talked to Morris briefly and kind of communicated to him, and the concern I hear is, am I getting the real guy? Am I getting Nate Morris how he really feels, or is this a curated image? It doesn't mean he's necessarily being fake. Maybe you believe that is the case, but there's a politician that I like a fair amount, and as time has gone on, as far as they go, I've gotten to know them a lot better, and I don't feel this way, but they voted fantastic. They had great policy positions, but whenever you talk to them, and this is a different politician, like I said, I'm not going to name the name, but whenever you talk to them, I always felt I wasn't getting the real them. And then one day, after some time spent around me and seeing a track record of being somebody that they could trust, they kind of let down the guard, and I got to hear them talk, and they really supported what they said. It was just clearly a point where they said, I trust that you're not going to use anything I say against me and how I say it. And that's what's really key. The position didn't change on this politician. How they expressed themselves became a lot more real and less curated, because they knew they could trust and speak their mind. And by that, I mean being like, I hate that guy. I can't get this to work. This person's driving me crazy. Just kind of talking like that, instead of just saying, yes, that's a very good position and I believe in that and blah, blah, blah. And I realized that, and through that conversation and in that moment, I realized that honestly, especially new politicians don't know people very well. What they can suffer from is trying and being really, really careful about what's being held against you. I mean, people ask me all the time, Andrew, are you going to be running for office again? And the answer is most likely not. I've said enough things on camera. I mean, I've put out literally hundreds of episodes at this point of the Andrew Cooperrider Show. I'm also working on Late Night on the Right, a late night talk show where we make jokes and things like that. And through doing those two things, I'm putting out a lot of content that you could snip and quote, and definitely hold it against me out of context, especially. And you never know, especially when you're running for the kind of race where there's millions of dollars being spent, who's recording what you have to say? Who's, going to use that information you give them against you? Because of that, you put up a guard, and that can hold off people. And politicians have to figure out how to balance. How do I stay on guard, but don't come across when I'm talking to individuals like somebody who's hiding something? Because I'm not really hiding how I feel, maybe. I'm just hiding how I would normally express it. Because, look, I don't want it clipped and taken out of context and then used against me. And I think that might be some of what's going on for Nate Morris right now. Very fixable thing. One thing is to get in front of more people, talk to more people, and try to build those relationships, but also try to, slouch a little bit when you talk to people, try to let your guard down as much as you can, basically, while still, of course, being careful about the words you say. So there you go, just a little breakdown about that. I do want to say I will, in the month of November, be putting out an episode. I'm doing a little bit of a digital forum with those three. They've all agreed to be a part of this, where I send them over some questions, they'll record a response, and we'll play them all together. So that's pretty exciting. Now, moving on to the schools side of things here. So Fayette County Public Schools, obviously cash-strapped, having issues, tried to raise taxes, didn't, missing tens of millions of dollars potentially out of their contingency fund, facing potentially the state taking over if they fall below that 2% contingency fund, facing deficits in the budget. And so Liggins was pulled before the legislature and asked some questions here. This is Lindsay Tishner and him going back and forth about travel. Let's go ahead and take a listen to what he had to say.
The average expense of these credit card statements is $400,000 a month. There's 115 different credit cards, 50 of them issued to the central office employees. The amount of expenditures on there for travel alone is jaw-dropping. I counted August, $127,000 of travel in August, with $52,000 of that at the Galt House. And I thought maybe August is a little abnormal. Got to about $80,000, and then I ran out of time to count because some of the presentations were going on. $80,000 for September. On the purchase orders for reimbursement for yourself, where it says at the top of this page, it's about kids, for your reimbursements alone for travel is $60,000. How can you ensure to the taxpayers that these expenditures are legitimate for the purposes of educating the students in Fayette County schools?
Thank you, Senator Tishner, for that question. That when it comes to travel, one of the things that we've determined and found that we are unique in Kentucky. There are many opportunities to really network with other school systems throughout the nation that are similar to us, have similar demographics, or urban centers within their own states that we take advantage of. And so every single trip, if you say, that takes place is scrutinized through that lens. Are there probably trips that probably could not have happened? More people went on them than they should have. Absolutely. I will not sit here and say that's not the case. Leading in a post-pandemic world has truly been unique, and that is one of the things that I hear more often than not. That is one of the focuses of many of the trainings and experiences that I take advantage of, and many of my colleagues as well that work in the district, because it is a unique experience. And so although I come in with a wealth of experiences under my belt, leading in post-pandemic has truly been something that has been challenging in the P-12 education world. I
tell you what, that kind of response, I'm surprised he'd be let into any restaurants and not be charged with bringing in his own food, because that was certainly a word salad. Though something he did admit to in there is that perhaps maybe some of these trips they shouldn't have taken, perhaps too many people went on these trips. But one thing to point out, and this is just really key to understand, is that in the year of 2024, this according to a Herald Leader article, Fayette County Public Schools spent twice as much on travel as Jefferson County Public Schools is having their own financial issues we'll go over in a bit, as Jefferson County's public schools did. And yet they have half the number of students. Another thing pointed out during that hearing by Senator Steve West, I believe it was 2017, the farthest they could go back, compared to now, the amount of students added into the school system there in Fayette County schools has been about 1,000. But the number of staff that has been added since then is also about 1,000. They've added a staff member for every single student that they've put in place. And over half of those have been added to the central office, not teachers, but into the central office. And so questions abound about, is that the proper thing you should be doing? Clearly not. On top of the travel issues and spending like a drunken sailor, adding in that kind of level of staffing is quite crazy. But a lot of these school districts are struggling because the federal government, they've been using federal government dollars in a way that's maybe not technically for what they were used for, but using it to fund other aspects of the school system. They've gotten used to it. Now those federal dollars are being taken away, and they got to make cuts. But a lot of them are unwilling to do so, or sometimes even they're hiding information. And that's what we're finding out going on in Jefferson County Public Schools there in Louisville. There was a board meeting here earlier this week where the school board members found out for the first time that the school district, unless something changed, will be insolvent. That's right, insolvent within 2 years, and they're going to have to sell assets in order to cover their deficit. We'll be covering that after this short break. You're listening to The Andrew Cooperrider Show. If you want to see where else to listen, you can visit theandrewshow.com. We'll be back in a few short minutes. And you're back here in this final segment of The Andrew Cooperrider Show. So Jefferson County Public Schools is facing a problem. They have a $188 million deficit they're facing over this next year. They will continue to have deficit and deficit spending and eventually spin themselves into insolvency, where they will no longer have enough money on hand to pay payroll and contractors. And this is all being brought to the board in plain terms for the first time now that they're facing this problem. And I want to play for you a snippet from that where the leadership, the financial leadership of the district, admits to actually hiding information from them. Let's go ahead and take a listen to that.
So am I correct to hear you say that you were directed to mislead the board in your narrativizing of the financial position?
No, sir. What I would say is that the working budget that was provided to you, I'll give an example. In the tentative budget for last spring, part of that was a division by division breakdown of the increases of our org charts. Very specific, every division and how much they've had org charts over the last increases over the last 3 years. Increases beyond what the trade versus gain was. That table was removed. I tried to incorporate that data.
So why was the table removed? That's pertinent information.
It was in discussions. It was not viewed as pertinent and relevant, and maybe data that would be useful for creating. For throwing out allegations about JCPS more so than pertinent, relevant data.
But isn't that deception?
I would call it a judgment.
You call it
so the document presented was our document, and the decision to remove that was obviously not. If we didn't believe in having that in there, we wouldn't have had it in there to begin with. But ultimately, there are certain strategic decisions that we have to follow the district lens on.
This can be fixed. It will be fixed under Dr. Yearwood's leadership. He's inspiring. He inspires me every time I meet with him. But here's the thing. We can't keep doing what we've always done and expect to be able to survive the way we have.
And we can't keep deleting pertinent information. or information that does not present the full picture of what the board has to weigh and what the board has to decide. And so I would just request that moving forward, that that the board be respected enough to receive all of the pertinent information about every decision that is placed before this board. If it needs to be embargoed, we do have a mechanism for that. But the board needs to be presented with all of the requisite information so that we can make a well-rounded decision for the good of this district. I don't think any of us, I know Mr. Craig and I, who have been here for almost 8 years, certainly we've done, we're proud of the work that this district has done, but this is the first time that I'm hearing anything about selling assets.
So there you go. He admits, like, look, we just decided not to share it because listen to the reasoning too behind that. So one, it dealt with pay, and they didn't want to share a table to show how much individuals' pay increases have increased absent of the actual cost of living adjustment increases. They said because it might be used against Jefferson County Public Schools for political reasons. It's almost like they're admitting that, well, we didn't want to give you this information because we're worried it would become public. And if it became public that certain groups have been getting raises and other groups hadn't, that might be used against us. Which raises like a lot of questions about who's been getting raises and why. Has it been central office that's been getting higher increases than the teaching staff has, and they didn't want the teaching staff to know that? And he says they were instructed to take out this table they created that they thought would be important information, but they decided not to go ahead and share it. And that might have changed what the board did. They might have decided to not give a cost of living adjustment to certain groups, certain members, certain employees that have gotten larger increases compared to others. And that's probably why they didn't want to share that information, is because they didn't want the board to come to the wrong conclusion. And by wrong, I mean the conclusion that, well, they wanted them to come to. They didn't want to come to something different than what they wanted them to make a decision. Obviously, the thing to do here is to fire everybody, but instead they're saying, look, it's nobody's fault. Maybe it's some people's fault, but it's nobody's fault. But let's go ahead and let's try to fix this. And so some quick questions regarding solutions were offered. And I want to share with you some of the first questions asked because I think it's important. So here's one. The first question asked by a school board member there was, what if they put people on NTI more? What if they had more of their students learning through a computer? Would that save money? That was literally one of their first suggestions. What if we just, took them out of the classroom? Is that a good idea? Now, obviously, the data behind a lack of in-person learning is clear. Part of the reason why our school systems, as they tell us all the time, this is a post-pandemic world that we're leading in. And in a post-pandemic K through 12 world, the challenge here is that they took a bunch of kids out of the classroom and they didn't properly learn. And so yet, this idea of a school system who's, by the way, there to educate kids, the first thought is, what if we give them NTI? Some of the other ideas made, of course, is to raise taxes, put in place a utility tax on cell phone bills, power bills, and other things that the school district doesn't currently have in Jefferson County Public Schools. Of course, that was one of the first ideas. Another idea they had was to lobby the legislature to change the definition of something. You see, school districts have something called a compensating rate when it comes to their property taxes. And that is the rate at which you would tax property at, adjusted for property values, to keep the tax at the same dollar figure. So basically, a compensating rate, this is the best way to explain it. Maybe your property value went up 5% or 4%, 6% over the course of a year, let's say. Well, the compensating rate is the rate at which they should tax your property value in order for the actual check you write to be the same amount every year. And by law, they're mandated to not allow that actual check you write to be increased by more than 4% a year. So that's the actual tax dollar you write. And one of their suggestions was to lobby the legislature to change the law so that it's a 4% increase over the current property value. Basically meaning that they want, and they argue that this would be more clear, people would understand. I think this would be a great idea. We should get the legislature on board. I can tell you right now, JCPS, and I'll tell you right now, legislators, you try to pass that law, I'm going to be standing right there in your way, raising all kinds of holy heck and raining down all that I can muster. Because at the end of the day, it's to check you right. And if you're allowed to keep the rate the same with a 4% increase, even adjusted for a 6% property value, that means year over year, your taxes, the amount you actually write, could increase by as much as 10% in 1 year. The legislature, if you're even thinking of okaying that, you need to get your head examined. And I'm sure every single person that listens to this show would agree with me. Allowing these school districts to increase taxes as much as 10% without it being able to be recalled every year is ridiculous and needs to be dealt with. Some of the other ideas, though, they put out, raising taxes, utility taxes, perhaps maybe they could if they're transparent enough now, maybe the public will buy in enough that they won't recall a tax if they put out a recallable tax rate. Another suggestion one of them had was even maybe a raise for the board. You know, these board members are only paid $150 a meeting. This is a $2 billion organization. Board members are paid normally hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to lead those kinds of organizations, so they're not getting people with the proper expertise. So maybe if they just gave everybody on the board a raise, the financial situation of the school would be better. That was a real suggestion. They were like sitting there like, we're out of money. What's an idea? And one of the board members was like, what if we gave ourselves a raise? Huh? Everybody's in agreement with this. Those are the real ideas they put forward. Absolutely ridiculous. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Thank you all so much for joining me. We'll be back here next week. I hope you have a great rest of your day.